Again is Leith Van Onselen, the unconventional economist who writes with such common sense. Welcome, Leith.
G'day, David. Thanks for having me on again.
Leith, one of the matters which you've written about is in relation to immigration, and that is because it arises because the Minns government, instead of strongly opposing immigration into Sydney, which seems to be the major target, along with Melbourne for many immigrants. What you've also written about is what is shown in the drawing which is coming up on the screen, and that is that this is going to produce terrible cities, particularly along the eastern coast, and they're going to be more and more unlivable. But you've also pointed out, I was reading a piece by you, about the standards of building, the jerry-built building in some aspects. And I think that it seems to me that what Minns is offering, where he's going to crowd these 6-storey unit buildings near railway stations, I don't think this is really going to be a solution which will excite people. What's your view on this?
No, and to be quite frank, David, the same thing's happening in Melbourne. So, the Minns government's said they're going to do that. The Victorian government has, I'm not sure if viewers have heard that the Victorian government's come up with this $200 billion suburban rail loop boondoggle, the worst project I think I've ever seen in my life, where they're basically going to build this 90-kilometre orbital railway, which nobody asked for, underground through all these middle ring suburbs. And the way they're going to justify it is they're going to then build high-rise on top of it to try and make the project viable, which it never will be. It's been rejected by the Auditor General, and every single infrastructure expert has just been a complete waste of money that nobody asked for. But to your point, the Victorian government is doing exactly the same thing. They want to basically put up high-rise shoeboxes in the middle ring suburbs and everywhere else to try and accommodate all the extra people that are coming into the country via net overseas migration. And I've argued, ad nauseum for a long time that this is an absolute disaster policy. And the reason why we know it's a disaster policy is because we did this same thing at the, latter half of last decade. So viewers might remember that if you're a resident of Sydney or Melbourne, you remember that we had a massive high-rise apartment construction boom between 2015 and up to the pandemic. And we saw literally, tens of thousands of high-rise apartment buildings go up across both cities. And it turned out that a lot of them were highly defective. So very poorly built, ugly, with flammable cladding, balcony defects, leaks, poor foundations. We've seen several buildings actually have to be evacuated, like the Opal and Mascot Towers in Sydney. And it's basically created this massive problem where owners now are facing huge bills. And, the New South Wales Strata Title Office and your new building regulator up in Sydney actually estimated that around 60% of apartments that were built post 2015, apartment buildings, complexes, had serious defects. And the way I see it is, if we're going to import so many people so quickly and you have to build houses for them very quickly, you're obviously going to cut corners, which is exactly what we did last decade. And you can't have a quality housing system and a quality, construction system if you have to slap up apartment buildings incredibly quickly to accommodate this mass population growth. And all it's going to end up doing is just creating these, ticky-tacky high-rise towers across our major cities that are going to have, defects. They're going to be very poor quality, and they're going to end up having to be built, pulled down in 20 or 30 years. And it's going to cost a lot of money and lead to a lot of waste. And, I just ask you, is this really the future we want for our cities? Is this really a step up in our living standards? And, there were projections from the Urban Task Force, which is a development lobby, and they projected that Sydney's dwelling composition will go from 55% detached houses, as at the time of the 2016 census, to just 25% detached houses by 2057. So, in a relatively short period of time, 31 years, Sydney's housing composition is going to go from more than half being detached houses to only a quarter being detached houses. And one half of Sydney, so 50% of Sydney's housing stock is going to be apartments by 2057, if you believe the Urban Task Force projections. And I'd argue that that's a pretty diabolical future for, our children and grandchildren. They're going to effectively, detached houses are going to only be the purview of the rich, and everyone else is going to have to rent high-rise apartments. And that's effectively the plan under this ridiculous Big Australia policy that we're running. And I'll just remind viewers that the latest intergenerational report that was released in 2023 tipped that Australia's population is going to grow from its current size now of 27 million by 13.5 million people in just 39 years to 40.5 million people. Now, that sounds like a lot, but just to put that into perspective, 13.5 million people in 39 years is like adding a current Sydney, a current Melbourne, and a current Brisbane worth of population in just 39 years. So can you imagine what that means, adding a Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane that we have currently to Australia's population in just 39 years? There's no way you can build enough houses to accommodate those people, certainly not good quality houses, and there's no way that you can build enough infrastructure. And what it means is that basically Australia's living standards are going to be eroded massively if we continue with this mass immigration madness that has been foisted upon us by the Australian government and the Australian Treasury.
Interesting thing in New South Wales, I don't know if it's the same in the other states, one of the big concerns a few months ago, which seemed to be in the news all the time, was gender balance in the construction industry. There seemed to be an obsession about getting women into doing work which many women don't want to do, apparently. The other thing is that they don't seem to be, in seeking immigrants, they don't seem to be bringing in many people who are construction workers. So there seems to be a loss of purpose in this immigration program, which just suddenly emerged from the Albanese government. You pointed out recently about what has happened to our universities. Could you remind us of what your impression is of what universities have become?
Well, yeah, my view is that universities have lost their social contract and their public good aspect. So it used to be that the universities existed to, obviously teach Australians, in higher education and to benefit Australia more generally in terms of uplifting our skills. But unfortunately, our universities have basically just turned into middlemen to the, mass immigration racket, whereby they've lowered standards, so entry standards, teaching standards, in order to grow the international student base aggressively, and by offering cookie cutter courses and those sorts of things. And the students come here primarily, at least the ones who come from South Asia and Africa and those sorts of places, which are now the majority of the students that we get from South Asia. They've lowered standards to get as many of those students in as possible, and a lot of those students come here purely so that they can work and that they can hopefully get permanent residency. So our higher education system has effectively turned into a migration scam, whereby the universities privatise the gains from migration through extra student fees and those sorts of things, while the costs are pushed onto the rest of us, and most notably to Australian renters in the rental market, because the students come here and they need somewhere to live, and then they have to compete with Australians for rents. I'll be quite frank, David. I'm not a fan of Australia's university system the way it currently stands. I think it's sold out and it's been effectively commercialised in the wrong way.
One of the targets mentioned in the budget was that sometime in the future, 80% of Australians will have a degree, a university degree. Is there any sense, do you think, in such a target?
No. I think Australia would be better served if less people went to university. So, unfortunately, viewers might recall that about a decade or so ago, the government, it was under the Rudd-Gillard government, they brought in a demand-driven university system where they basically said anyone who wants to go to university should go to university, and they encouraged it. And so Australia got to about 45% of young people now go to university, which I think is a figure that's too high. the federal government announced recently that they want a target of, I think, 55%, and then to grow it even further, of young people to go to university. Now, at the same time as they've done that, they've also disincentivised people doing vocational education or going into TAFEs. And as a result, Australia, through decades of this favouring universities over other areas, we now have massive skill shortages across the country because we have loads of people doing, quite frankly, a lot of it's Mickey Mouse courses at university, and then they end up going into the labour market and they just do menial jobs. But so nowadays we have a lot of menial jobs now of people with university degrees, whereas previously those jobs could be done without a university degree. And the bigger issue is I think we need to have more people doing trades and doing vocational education, because that's where the shortages are. And to be quite frank, a lot of people aren't really suited to going to university, but they end up going to university anyway. And it's all been, sort of encouraged because university has become the socially acceptable thing to do. Whereas, if you don't go to university, you're considered inferior. And I think that's wrong. One of the biggest mistakes this country made, David, was it got rid of trade schools. So when I was growing up, there used to be obviously high schools, and then you had trade schools as well, which were effectively, vocationally oriented high schools, which taught people, trades while they're at high school. Then they went on to apprenticeships and those sorts of things. Unfortunately, the Howard government shut down a lot of those schools. And as a result, you fast forward 30 years and now we have massive shortages in the trades.
We certainly had very good TAFE, technical and further education, establishments.
And a lot of that has been gutted.
Yes.
A lot of that has been gutted because in favour of universities. And, it's one of the reasons why we have a lack of builders now, because, we don't have enough tradies because of the sorts of policies we introduced 30 years ago, or 20 to 30 years ago, which has basically gutted our vocational system. And it's idiotic policy. We need to reverse that, but instead the government's doubling down and wants more people to go to university.
I suppose this has nothing to do with the opinion polls. When they show the way people without degrees, or their attitude on various issues, people without degrees compared to those who have a university education, those who have a university education are more inclined to take the position offered by the Labour Party or the Greens, rather than those who don't have degrees, who seem to be more conservative. It has nothing to do with that, do you think?
I think it probably does have something to do with that, quite frankly, because, and we see that with attitudes to immigration, for example. So the cohorts that are most opposed to high levels of immigration tend to be, non-university educated. Those who are university educated tend to be more supportive of very high immigration, which is kind of ridiculous. And, a lot of it is this sort of woke ideology that has been bled into people now who go to university. And a lot of people, I've spoke to people and they agree with my arguments on high immigration, but they can't support them because that would be racist to support them. And, these tend to be people who are university educated, who think that way. So it's all, unfortunately they tend to fall for virtue signaling and those sorts of things over sound policy. And I just think the whole notion of requiring even more people to go to university, or to set a target that even more Australians go to university, is crazy. Because in order to do that, we're really going to have to scrape the bottom of the barrel and get people who are totally unsuited to university going to university when they'd be much better placed to do other things. And quite frankly, we don't have a shortage of business degree people and all these other, arts degree people and those sorts of things. So why do we need more of that? We need more vocational people. We need more tradespeople. And we need those industries to be, I wouldn't say cool again, but not be frowned upon. Because, the way the government is at the moment, they continue to look down on those areas and they continue to favour university education over all others, which is just wrong, quite frankly.
Yes, and going back to the earlier part of this discussion, what do brought together in your report, your post in January, I think it was, is that this concentration, this madness, this out-of-control immigration is bringing in immigrants essentially into the eastern capitals, especially Sydney and Melbourne, and it's making those cities very unpleasant cities, not because of the immigrants, but because it is straining the resources that are there, because they're not providing the hospitals, they're not providing the schools, they're not providing the roads and the transport for the additional people. They're putting people onto the transport routes, but those routes are already full. They're already full of people using them, and this will make it more and more intolerable for existing Australians. And as you rightly say, it won't increase in any great significant way the GDP. It'll just mean the GDP per capita will fall.
Yeah, so I live in Melbourne, just for disclosure. So I've lived here my whole life except for a few years when I lived in Canberra. And at the turn of the century, Melbourne's population was about 3.5 million people. It has grown by nearly 2 million people to about 5.4 million so far this century, so in about 24 years. And the forecast is for Melbourne to go to 9 million people by 2056. That is the official forecast from the state government. That is an extreme amount of growth. So from 3.5 million roughly at the turn of the century to 9 million people by the mid-2050s is an enormous amount of growth. And there is just no way you can ever build enough infrastructure for that, or build enough high-quality housing for that, or maintain living standards. And literally, I've seen the last 20 years Melbourne's livability just collapse in comparison to what it was. It takes forever to drive anywhere now. The traffic congestion is just permanently, bottlenecked in a lot of areas. And just the overall quality of life, everything looks worn out now. Like a lot of the infrastructure, just the signs are faded. Everything just kind of looks worn out. And obviously the housing situation is terrible. Like, 20 years ago, you could, on a modest income, you could buy a reasonable house with a backyard on a normal income. Nowadays, you're lucky to rent an apartment. And I suggest it's probably even worse in Sydney. But those, heaven help us what it's going to be like living in Melbourne in, 22 years, 32 years when Melbourne's population is forecast to go to 9 million people from, about 5.4 million currently. It's just going to be an absolute nightmare. And really, who in their right mind would say that that's an improvement in your living standards? It's not. It's a massive degradation. And, my view is just the numbers need to be dialed right back, because what the sorts of immigration we've had for 20 years has been wholly unsustainable. And it's especially bad if you live in Sydney and Melbourne. And it's also bad if you live in Brisbane, because now Brisbane's getting the outcasts from Sydney and Melbourne. So they're getting a lot of migration up north because people are fed up with Sydney and Melbourne, so they go to Brisbane, and now Brisbane's suffering with tent cities and those sorts of things. So, look, it's just a diabolical situation. They just need to dial it right back.
Just on Melbourne, and I think we will conclude on this point because time is running out. There was a time when Melbourne was probably the most beautiful city and one of the richest cities in the British Empire. Certainly when I was a boy, it was one of the most beautiful. It was the most beautiful city in Australia. Didn't have a harbour, but certainly its streets and its buildings were spectacular and very beautiful. Unfortunately, too many of them have gone, I think, by short-term policies. But it is sad to see the Australian cities going the way that the politicians are making them go. Thank you very much, Leith. You do bring a lot of common sense to the study of economics, and I think people do appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Speak to you next time.
Good.